Are you wondering about gun trusts in Idaho or NFA trusts? Well, you're in good shape because today on North Idaho Experience, Eric and I are going to sit down with Ben Allen, local attorney and expert in both of those things, to break it all down for us. Check it out. All right, we're talking about gun trusts today. Disclaimer, Eric and I know very little about this, but we have an expert with us, Ben Allen, local attorney. So we appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us.
You bet. My pleasure.
Dive into this topic that is very unknown to a lot of people, but very important as well.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah. So tell me, what the heck is a gun trust? Let's start there.
Yeah. So gun trust, we talk about gun trust, we are really looking at a form of ownership for a certain category of firearms. When we look at gun trust, there's so many different directions our conversation today can go. So I'll try to stick to some of the basics, but in order to work us through the basics, there's going to be some history lessons that we're going to have to go back and look at how we got to where we're at. And then there's going to be some, realistically political and philosophical discussions about what has happened in society and our culture that has led to the system as we know it functioning the way it does. So when you hear the term gun trust, in some states and in some jurisdictions, that term is going to be broken down into two subcategories. You're going to have what's known as an NFA trust, and then you're going to have what some legal practitioners are just going to refer to generally as a gun trust. In Idaho, we reside in a state where the state does not have its own separate set of firearms laws that are stricter than federal regulation. And because of that, we don't really have a need in Idaho, at least for a lot of purposes, to necessarily advance or for gun trusts that aren't NFA gun trusts to be very popular. So they can still exist, and they exist mostly as an estate planning function. So when we go down the realm of, if we're looking at, probate law, we're looking at asset protection laws, we're looking at, potentially somebody could be subject to federal inheritance tax. Maybe there's a way where in Idaho a certain individual might benefit from a non-NFA gun trust. But for our purposes, when we're talking about gun trust in Idaho, 99% of the time, if you hear the term gun trust, we're referring to an NFA gun trust.
So what is an NFA? What is that short
for?
For?
So NFA is short for the National Firearms Act. National Firearms Act was really the first federal legislation we had in our country that set out with the primary purpose of regulating firearms. The National Firearms Act was adopted in 1934, and it came on the heels of both massive gang violence in the inner cities and the more populated areas of our country, and it met with the crossroads of the Depression. So we're looking at two factors that both lined up perfectly that led to political leaders in our country saying we need to regulate firearms. The start of that really, you go back to 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, really one of the first big instances of gang violence that caused our society to take a step back and say the everyday working man is not in a position to defend their own life or property against these types of attacks. And so, you had mom and pop stores since, our country's inception that are defending their place of business or their residence with, whatever form of weaponry was available to the everyday common working man sitting behind the front desk or counter of their store. And now we're seeing gang violence result in fully automatic weapons.
Tommy guns.
Yeah. And then this concept that very few people knew anything about, and that was this device called a silencer, which, because they weren't common, most people had never even seen one. Misconceptions actually drove that aspect of the regulations. And so people thought you could take this device, put it on the end of a Tommy gun, and no one would ever know you were even pulling the trigger. You could just go in and silently massacre hundreds of people.
I think that's still a misconception out there, by the way.
Definitely is. But take, for instance, the misconception today where you can find videos on YouTube in 30 seconds.
True.
Back then, if you had never seen one, you would have no context to even have an educated opinion on whether or not these things do or don't do what people are saying. So you've got those things that are coming out of crossroads, and National Firearms Act in 1934 comes out and says, okay, we're going to create this category of firearms. We're going to call it Title II firearms. So Title I firearms aren't regulated under the National Firearms Act, didn't touch them. And that's what you and I would go down to, Cabela's or North 40 or Black Sheep. We'd pick off the shelf and we'd go purchase. So Title I firearms, you still got to go through a background check process. There's a Form 4473 that's got to be filled out. We got to make sure that you're not a prohibited person. But otherwise, you can go down to the store, you can pull it off the shelf, and you can drive home with it that day. At least in our state, you can. Title II firearms are firearms that have a higher degree of regulation. Because our legislators at the time realized that a outright prohibition on certain types of firearms probably was not going to pass constitutional muster, which maybe this is a good segue back into when we're talking about the influence that members of our judiciary have, right? This was a consideration. The individuals who were crafting the laws at the time thought there's no way we're going to push through new legislation that's going to ban firearms. The judges sitting on the Supreme Court aren't going to allow that. They're going to find that there's a violation of the Second Amendment. So how can we enact these regulations in such a way that it's going to pass both constitutional muster, but also be palatable for the public? And what they did was they didn't put it in Title 18 of the United States Code, where the rest of our crimes and punishments are found. They crammed it into Title 66, which is where the IRS and tax codes are.
Interesting.
So when you hear the term tax stamp today, it's still applicable. And it's applicable because all the way back in 1934, when the National Firearms Act was adopted, it was adopted as a tax code. And that was their way of pushing it through. So,
still happening today at a state level. Washington could not go after their constitution to limit gun rights. They had to get creative and go after the manufacturers or the distributors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to argue their results with reducing gang crime in major cities. I'm glad it was really, really effective.
Right. So we'll take that. We'll talk about what the National Firearms Act actually did. So it didn't ban them. Didn't say you can't have these items. What it did was it said you now have to go through a process of paying a tax on those items. And not only do you have to pay a tax, but we need to have some way of enforcing the regulation on the back end. So we're actually going to make your money pay for a stamp. And we're going to give you a physical, lickable stamp that is going to be your rite of passage to own a Title II firearm that says you are the possessor and owner of that item. And at the time, they set the price of a Tommy gun roughly in 1934 was in or around the $200 range. So they set a tax stamp at $200. $200 in 1934.
That's a lot.
After we account for the inflationary rates of our currency. Today's market, I think the last time I ran the numbers, it was like $4,900, so just shy of $5,000.
Wow.
So if you want a Title II firearm, which included, suppressors, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, we throw out the Tommy gun, even though that's almost not relevant anymore because of legislation that was passed later, which we'll chat more about. But you wanted any of those items back then, it was going to be reserved for a very elite class of individuals, and it was not going to be available for the common man. What that did was it didn't just prevent the vast majority of society from actually owning them. What it did was it stifled the technology and development because of the supply and demand. There was no more demand. So we had no incentive to advance the technology or development of those items. So from a societal perspective, the drafters of that legislation, as much as it sickens me, they knew what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to stifle the industry such that the industry didn't advance. And if the industry doesn't advance, then people aren't going to own these items.
They won't be available.
Won't be available.
Yeah.
And so we'll take that. I'm going to make some big jumps in time. So we're going to leap forward. And I'll bring us to, so we've got Gun Control Acts, 1968, 1986, both went into effect. There was a few pieces of those legislations that I think cut both directions. There was some compromise involved. Out of that, we ultimately wound up with no more manufacturing of fully automatic weapons for civilians. And so that's why I say as we move forward, the whole, Tommy gun argument, it's kind of moot for the most part. You can still possess a Title II firearm that's a fully automatic weapon. As a civilian, it's got to be manufactured before 1986. So in 1986, cost of those items jumped to, a couple $1,000s. Now it's a collector's item. So fully automatic weapons manufactured pre-86 for civilian ownership. A lot of times you're paying 15, 20 plus grand for the possession of those items. So those are kind of off the table, at least until, we get a new legislative amendment that changes that and allows civilian ownership of fully automatic weapons. If that ever comes, we don't know. But that's what it would need in order for those items to really be opened back up for civilian possession. So what we're stuck with is National Firearms Act really affecting short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and suppressors. Also, there's a category it's called any other weapon, or AOWs. Don't know if either of you fellas have heard that term.
Nope.
It's essentially a weapon that, I'm going to try to explain this in a way that's easily understandable to people that don't follow these laws. Think of it as this catch-all category that was really designed to grab any type of firearm that manufacturers are going to make, which doesn't meet the definition of any other type of firearm. So it was this catch-all category to say, hey, we don't want firearm manufacturers to look at the way we've structured these laws and then to just build weapons around them. So we're going to create this category called any other weapon, and we're going to, have that be what grabs any of these other types of firearms that are being manufactured. That was kind of the goal. There's a lot of nuances to it, but we've actually got quite a few different types of firearms that are sitting on the shelves that fall into that AOW category. So we moved to today, and we've seen this massive surge in availability of suppressors in particular. SBRs, SBSs, a little more, but massive surge in suppressor ownership. Why is that? Well, the tax stamp has never changed. So a couple of things. One, it really was just going to take inflation to catch up with the $200. And it was going to catch it at some point. Whether it took 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, it was going to catch it. And about the point in time where we started seeing the cost of the tax stamp equating to the value of the firearm itself again, we started seeing them increase in popularity. Moving forward to today, suppressor, you can get one off the shelf for $600, $700, $800 pretty easily. Cost of the tax stamp at $200 really wasn't a deterrent anymore. And so about the last decade or so, we've been in that category where most people weren't batting an eye at the cost of the tax stamp. That said, they were batting an eye at other things. So even though inflation tackled the tax stamp cost issue, now we're looking at these extremely long turnaround times for processing applications for the tax stamp. Obviously, anyone that's followed these regulations knows that very recently our federal government did away with the actual cost of the tax stamp, so the $200 isn't a thing anymore. We got that taken care of, but the stamp itself is still there. Mm-hmm. So if you want a Title II firearm, you've still got to go through the process of filling out and submitting your Form 4. Form 4 is the actual ATF form that's utilized in order to give the approval for the tax stamp and then receive that tax stamp.
To confirm real quick, so the tax no longer exists. The tax stamp still exists.
Correct.
That's the most government thing I've heard today. That makes
and
sense.
it's no longer the lickable stamp. In
Right.
fact, I've been told that those are now collector's items. I've got a handful of them.
Oh, that's cool.
They went to an electronic stamp a few years back. And then actually, I think the last maybe 3 or 4 tax stamps I've gotten back, they stopped mailing them all together. Now they just send you an electronic file that just
The last
contains
one
them.
I got is
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
It's not nearly as cool.
You go through a kiosk and like you're there.
Yeah.
It's kind of nice.
Right.
Do you foresee with future changes in leadership in the federal government that coming back, the price going higher? Do you think that would be an easy or like an attainable goal for a future leadership?
It's a good question. I think it depends. I think we can see it go either direction. So I think there's a chance we might see a repeal of certain portions of the National Firearms Act altogether. I don't think socially our country is in a spot probably to touch the fully automatic weapons at this point. I do have more hope that we might be in a position where we can free up the availability for law-abiding citizens to more easily access SBRs, SBSs, and particularly suppressors. The suppressor issue is so ripe with misinformation that it's ludicrous. And in fact, as a social experiment, you can actually look around the globe, and there are countries, most European countries, where suppressor ownership, even though the country itself would be categorized as much more liberal than the U.S., the availability of suppressors is unregulated and in some instances even encouraged. There are certain cities within European countries that do not allow you to discharge a firearm in city limits unless it's suppressed, right? So, and these are very considered liberal gun control laws. And so, all of the science behind that is focused on health and hearing protection.
Yep.
And then we look at the way the U.S. has structured their laws in regards to gun trust, and it completely ignores science altogether.
We used them predominantly on our SWAT team here, and that was a huge factor in that, was just the health and hearing protection of the operators. When you're firing thousands of rounds every training session,
right,
that's significant. And that's even if you have ear pro. We had a guy come out from Silencer Co. that's talking about how you actually hear through the base of your skull, and all of that concussive damage, it's still causing damage.
You're potentially creating TBIs in an enclosed environment, firing off unsuppressed rifles.
Yep, and especially with the big push towards doing, movements inside of a, kill house or Connex boxes, even with frangible rounds.
Can we use the term shoot house, please? That was a little
shoot house.
extreme. Thank you.
I apologize.
Wow.
I'm out of the game. I'm not a politician. But but even with frangible rounds, there's significant hearing loss with people that are exposed to that many rounds.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It would be nice. So who needs a gun trust?
Yeah, it's a great segue. So we dealt with the historical context and how we got to where we're at now.
Yeah.
We've still probably got to go back at least 10 more years, because there was an order that was handed down at the federal level in 2016. That was really our last big twist on the tax stamp process, and particularly what was the applicability of a gun trust in this grand scheme of things. And so under the National Firearms Act, Title II firearms require a tax stamp. That tax stamp essentially assigns possession and ownership to an individual. An individual, under the definitions, included human beings, entities, and, well, it includes some other things. We'll keep it there. Individuals and entities. That's 99% of, gun trust owners. Okay. The individuals, if the entity is a business, are going to be the owners or managers of that business. If the entity is a trust, it's going to be the trustees of that trust. If the tax stamp is assigned to just the individual themselves, now ownership is just restricted to that person. It is a federal felony for somebody to be in possession of a Title II firearm if that firearm is not assigned to them via tax stamp. So we've got individuals that are going out and they're purchasing Title II firearms. They're purchasing them in their own names individually. And that means that item, whether it's a suppressor, an SBR, SBS, that item is uniquely theirs now. The only way they can give possession of that away to somebody else is to go back through the tax stamp process and to effectuate a new transfer of that item, receiving new approval from the federal government, your wait times, your new tax stamp that comes in that authorizes ownership. And so individuals were looking at a better method for saying the practical application of my use of firearms is that I might be using it one day, my spouse might be using it the next day, my son or daughter might be using it the next day, and my buddy might even want to borrow it to go out to the range with. So all of these people potentially, I could want to have possession of this. But since it's a Title II firearm and it's owned by me individually, we're both committing a felony if I let them have this. Even if they didn't want it, it still poses problematic circumstances for individuals, for instance, that are married, right? I've got that Title II firearm sitting by the front door. I'm out of the house. ATF agent, for whatever reason, we don't know, shows up at the door, knocks, my wife answers it, and the SBS with the suppressor is sitting right there next to her. You guys have law enforcement background. You know the concept of constructive possession. Doesn't necessarily need to be physically in her hands for that logical conclusion to be made that she's in constructive possession of that item. And so when we recognize that, we see first and foremost the value of having some other structure for ownership that does not place us in that position of liability. Now, that's not, I would say, the primary reason why most Title II firearm owners actually set up gun trust in the beginning. Why did they set up gun trust in the beginning? Well, they set up gun trust in the beginning because when the suppressor ownership started increasing in popularity, early 2000s, these things started being more and more common. There was essentially, I don't want to call it a loophole. It was just the way the law was structured. Enabled individuals to apply for a tax stamp as a trust, so their trust entity is who's actually on the tax stamp application. And there was no requirement for them to disclose who was behind the trust. So it essentially served as this wall of confidentiality for the applicant to say, as long as the trust is applying for the tax stamp, government's not going to know that I even am here. And for a lot of people, the anonymity was the biggest incentive. And that stayed in place until 2016. So 2016, we had the presidential administration at that time. We had some events happened. We had, I believe it was the Sandy Hook tragedy occurred in around that time. Gun control started moving to the forefront of a lot of people's minds again. And the presidential administration said, hey, there's this issue with these gun trusts. These gun trusts are being used and we don't know who's behind them. And we think that it's criminals. So we need to reveal who's behind these. Well, in order to push that through and in order to make that order palatable, there was a degree of compromise. I won't render my opinion on who I think got the best shake out of this, but the Pro 2A side of things said, all right, well, there's a second issue with this. The second issue with this is under the current structure for tax stamp approval. One of the components for approval is the chief law enforcement officer's authorization to approve the application. And so what's happening all around the country is in more liberal sectors of our society, we have chief law enforcement officers who are utilizing the chief law enforcement officer authorization as a weapon to just outright deny Title II firearm ownership. So they're denying all of these applications. And even though there's nothing wrong with the application, the person applying is a law-abiding citizen, they're just getting denied because the chief law enforcement officer in that jurisdiction just doesn't want guns in their jurisdiction. And so the compromise was, okay, we will agree to allow for disclosure of the trustees of the trust, so you can see who's behind the trust, but you need to remove the chief law enforcement officer's authority to essentially block applications. So what they did was they moved it to a notification. So if you've applied for a tax stamp recently, there will be a CLEO notification. And it's just a one-page form. I don't know what happens to them. I mean, maybe you can ask ISP. Maybe they just go in a big garbage. I'm not sure. I don't know if it means anything to them, but it's a one-page form that says this individual or this trust entity is applying for a tax stamp within your state. So it goes out, and it's just a notification now. They have no authority to essentially block it through the application process. So that was a trade-off. Since that time, since 2016, we now have to disclose who's behind the trust. In other words, who the trustees are. And when that happened, a lot of people whose primary goal for using a gun trust was just the anonymity said, well, I'm out. I might as well just go back to applying as an individual. Not quite the best option for the reasons that I started with. And that is, it still restricts ownership to that individual now if it's not on the trust.
So question, if does the gun trust also protect, say I own a short barrel shotgun and I die, what happens to that gun now if I'm the individual owner? Whereas with a trust, would that automatically, and say my wife is named in the trust, she would be able to take over ownership of it?
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, so it protects that situation as well? Because normally, like, if I didn't have a trust and I die, what happens to that gun?
Yep, it becomes a probate asset,
okay.
Right? So the goal of utilizing any type of living trust for most people in the estate planning realm is to take assets that would otherwise be probatable assets and move them outside of probate. So when we're talking in the context of a gun trust, if the gun trust owns those items, we don't have to jump through all the hoops of, going through it's actually a Form 5 that's used for estates. So we've now got to hold this item. There's actually this weird in-between stage where a personal representative or administrator of your estate hasn't yet been appointed, but the gun exists sitting in your back bedroom or your gun safe. And legally, nobody under the code has a right to possession of that item. And so if it was owned by an individual, right? And so, the code says that an administrator of a decedent's estate assumes that authority for purposes of distributing that asset. And so we're in this in-between stage where until we actually, file the probate and get the letters of administration or the letters testamentary that grant authority to the personal representative of the estate, we've got kind of this black hole. The ATF recognizes that. In fact, I've communicated with the ATF on it before, and they've said, hey, you know what? If you already know who the PR is, we're not going to, ask any more questions beyond that. Just get us the letters of appointment as soon as you can, and we have.
Okay.
But then you've got to go through the process of utilizing a Form 5 to now transfer that asset to whoever's supposed to be getting it. So now we're going back to the ATF for more approval. When you use a gun trust, it's a non-probate asset. Trust owns that asset. If you're in charge of the trust, as long as your trust was drafted well enough that there's a succession plan within it, we know who's going to take over the trust assets when you pass. We don't have any Form 5 transfers. That asset can theoretically stay in the trust indefinitely as long as the trust was drafted such that that's practical. And that item can move seamlessly from one trustee to the next trustee and get where it needs to go.
Can I put my kids on that trust, or is there an age limit?
So you don't want to put your kids on the trust if they would not have the authority to possess those items as a trustee.
Okay.
You can list your kids as a beneficiary, and then you can draft in language within that trust that talks about what happens if your beneficiaries haven't reached the age of majority or otherwise aren't allowed to take those items, how they're going to be held until that time comes.
Is that 21 years old in Idaho, or is it 18?
Depends on the type of firearm.
Okay.
So, yeah, and you're right, in Idaho, it also depends on state law too. So states can restrict that. So you're going to be looking at holding that firearm, reaching out to an attorney within the state of residence of whoever the beneficiary is, identifying what rules or regulations govern those items in that state, and then going from there. But by keeping it in the trust, that item's safe. And if the trust is structured so that the trust can stay into perpetuity, those items can remain in that trust, and you're just essentially moving the trustees around to put the person in charge that you actually want to have possession of those items.
Okay.
So to clarify, when you say write into your trust, have somebody smarter than you if you're a dumb door kicking.
So not ChatGPT.
No.
Okay.
Have somebody smarter than you draft that into your trust to protect you and your beneficiaries. What this entire process, what you're talking about in the tax stamp process and then retention of the firearms with the tax, it just seems prohibitively challenging to interpret. I mean, that's and I was a cop, for about 12 years. And still, when it comes to some of the ATF stuff, and I was involved in cases, and I got to be honest, I never felt right about it. It made it so challenging. How do you know and ensure that you are in compliance with not only state but federal laws?
Yeah.
That was always a tough one for me to swallow, right? And some of that enforcement, because if you do it from a local side, if the law is not clear, I mean, you operate in that capacity. Courts don't like vagueness, right? And it's just a hard one to interpret. So when it went into some of these, especially with tax stamps, hearing that, it's really great that there's protection. People are getting protections from it. That one's a tough one for me to swallow.
Yeah.
From the enforcement side, it's just tough to hear it. And again, anytime I saw that enforcement, I just didn't feel right about it. There are exceptions, right? If you're out there making pipe bombs, bro, or you're like making come on now, there's within reason. I think common sense does prevail. But if a guy's got an SBR and he doesn't have his tax stamp on his person or with it, come on, you know what I mean?
That was my next question. What's the law when I say I take my short barrel shotgun to the range? Do I need to physically have the tax stamp with me at all times?
Yeah, so I've had some really good conversations over the years with our local ATF agents, and I think the general sentiment here is as long as you've got a copy of it that's accessible, you're in the clear. And so a lot of the clients that I do gun trust for, they'll just keep a copy of that tax stamp on their phone. So they open up their Photos app, they got a folder in there that's tax stamps. And inside their tax stamps folder that they share with all of their other trustees, so everyone's got the same, shared album. They've got all the different tax stamps. I mean, realistically, you're never going to open that, but you need to know that it's there, right? You need to know, if something were to ever happen and I were stopped, I've got a copy of that tax stamp right here. I can pull up the electronic copy, and I can show them that, this, Genesis Arms Gen 12 SBS with the, JK Armament SG12 Suppressor. Here's the 2 tax stamps for those 2 items.
Yeah.
Would that cover someone, say you're going into Washington for some purpose and you have it with you? Are you still protected by that? Does it change when state laws come into play?
Yeah, so your state laws have the ability to be more restrictive than the federal law. In Idaho, we don't even think about this because our state doesn't have more restrictive gun laws.
Yeah.
There is the Gun Owners Protection Act that was passed as federal legislation, which was designed to protect gun owners to safely pass from one. The term I often hear used is friendly jurisdiction. So I'll use that terminology from one friendly jurisdiction to another friendly jurisdiction, even if it means traversing between unfriendly jurisdictions. Okay. That said, that applies to only certain types of Title II firearms. So when we're talking about suppressors, great example. If you're wanting to go from Coeur d'Alene to Boise, and you're going to drive around through Spokane, down through Oregon, and back in, the Gun Owners Protection Act is supposed to protect you in that transport. You're leaving from a location and you're reaching a destination, both of which are locations where possession of that item is lawful. You've got the ability to traverse through and to make reasonable stops. So that's supposed to be allowed. We often see that being applied in the context of airline travel too, where people should have the ability to say, hey, just because my plane has a layover in Chicago doesn't mean I'm going to get yanked off the plane and taken into custody.
Something like that happened in New York, and it was with a component of a firearm. It wasn't even a firearm where you got charged locally for that. So does it kind of depend on the state?
It kind of depends on the state. The other thing that I would note, though, is that, for instance, if we're looking at SBRs or SBSs, the rules are a little different. So if you are engaged in interstate transport of those items, you're actually supposed to request approval of the ATF. So there's a separate form that can grant you permission to travel across those state lines for, I think it's up to a year. But I mean, back to your earlier point, sometimes it's just enough of a headache that people just don't even bother with it, right?
Yeah. Just stick it in the front of the U-Haul and bury it with stuff and don't say anything.
Well,
that's not my recommendation. I'm just kidding.
I've gone through that before because we
Yeah.
transported everything for SWAT Basic in Arizona. So there was different regulations and restrictions. But you're right, it is prohibitive. And I sometimes feel like that's intentional. It's like that'll be less people that are going to try to engage when and do it, and it's going to be more people that potentially err in the manner in which they do it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I have a kind of a same topic, but a little off the wall, so I apologize. You didn't have time to prepare for this. But making suppressors in Idaho, I've been told that it's legal in Idaho as long as it says made in Idaho and all components are manufactured in Idaho. Do you have knowledge on this?
I think Texas would be your best example of maybe how that's going to play out. So Texas has really led this initiative to say as long as it's made in Texas and all components are from Texas, it falls outside the scope of federal regulation, and therefore a tax stamp cannot be required. I think that question has yet to be decided by our courts.
I don't want to be the guinea pig on that one,
No.
just for the record.
I think it's yet to be decided by our courts, but that's there's a strong movement in Texas with that being the methodology that certain people are going to try to push forward. That said, I mean, as long as you jump through the right hoops, you can make a SBR, SBS, you can make a suppressor. The ATF utilizes what's known as a Form 1. You said you're a Genesis guy, so Genesis, they'll assist people with Form 1s and get you pointed in the right direction for those. So there's a process that you can go through to essentially, assemble or manufacture your Title II firearm. And the process, you've got to submit diagrams or sketches of how the firearm's going to look. You got to disclose this can be the serial number, things like that. But ultimately, you'll get a tax stamp at the end on your Form 1 that says now you can be in lawful possession of that. So, it's not all that uncommon. I know quite a few different guys in the hunting community that have SBRs for backpacking and stuff like that. So they'll have an SBR, chambered in 6.5 Creedmoor or 3.38 Blackout or something like that. 8.6 Blackout, 3.38 Arc, that's the new one. 8.6 Blackout is probably the more common one for hunting, where you're producing an SBR that's got a 10 or 8 inch barrel on it. Thing's got a collapsible stock. It's going to fold right down into your backpack. You're on your way hiking up the hiking trail, and you don't have to worry about the oddity of passing people and tourists being weird that you're carrying a 30-inch long gun on your back or whatever the case may be.
Stop encouraging me to spend money. All right, this was not the intention of the podcast. To start writing. Oh God, that sounds awesome. I don't need that in my life right now.
So you can Form 1 those. You can make them yourself. You get approval from the federal government. I think directly touching on your question, it's more so based on can we produce these items and not have it be regulated by the ATF?
Yeah.
And that's the question that I think is still undecided.
That's where you get into like the solvent canisters and stuff like that.
Yeah, and those
guys
guys got hit pretty hard in the last administration. This administration, I don't think has really touched them, but last administration really made an effort to crack down on those. And those companies that were producing it, they spent a lot of time in the courtroom.
Yeah, I got you.
Well, it's a really interesting subject. I'm sure a lot of people out there will be thankful for the information that you provided right now. That was actually a better history lesson than I could have imagined.
Like everything else, you can see why. Like you think back to 19, you're like, all right, that makes some sense. And then like most things, then it grows legs and then starts extending further and gets politicized. Because back then, you're absolutely right. Mom and pop sitting in there, you have a guy coming with a Tommy gun and they've got a double barrel shot. Like that's not you can't protect yourself. Makes it challenging, but it isn't fascinating to me that they went at it with taxes.
It's fascinating to me that this has been going on for 100 years. And
it's still called a tax stamp. I never knew that's why it was called a tax stamp. I was like, why is it called a tax stamp?
Right.
Well, ask and you shall receive. That's interesting.
Wow. Yeah.
We seem to follow the same cycle. Well, I'm glad that people are out there doing it, and I think at some point in time, trusts are really can be beneficial for limiting of liability as well. And I think you touched on that.
Yep.
Yeah. That way it just protects your
sold.
Yeah,
I don't have one yet, but it's coming.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
conversation sold me on that.
Yeah.
Benjamin Allen, thank you, sir.
Oh,
You bet.
last one. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If you personally own suppressors or SBRs now, can you roll those into your
good
trust?
question.
Yep, so you got to go through the tax stamp process again. So you're going to have to file a new application for a tax stamp with the ATF, but you can. You can do it, and obviously now the tax stamp doesn't cost any money. I think that the barriers for transferring from your name individually into a trust have been, essentially reduced. Now the headache is just the wait time.
Do you go through your own FFL after your gun trust is established to do that?
I don't know if your FFL will help you with it. If you can utilize an FFL that has digitized their forms, it will streamline the process greatly for you. So I'm going to put a plug in here with East County Guns. I know they've got a kiosk in their shop, and I know they've helped quite a few clients of ours to be able to do the applications electronically. And I know it takes away a lot of the hesitation in doing the forms wrong.
It's faster. It's much faster. BZ over at North Idaho Arms will hook that up as well.
Okay, there you go.
He's got a kiosk there too.
Okay, perfect.
A lot of that, because I agree with you, because them, it's investing time and money into something that they aren't getting paid for necessarily.
Well, they're setting up for future business, right?
That's true.
That's a smart
Absolutely.
model. That's a smart model.
Absolutely. Cool.
Yeah.
That answered that question.
Great information, man. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
You bet.
Always
Thanks
a
for
pleasure
having
you
me.
on.
Yeah.
I think we'll have to do it again sometime and maybe talk about CCW laws. I don't know. There's a lot of cool gun laws, and you seem to be very knowledgeable about it, so much appreciated.
Oh, yeah. It is nice because you have the attorney perspective, and he's like, and then you have this. Okay, obviously knows the stuff. He knows more than me. That's cool.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate
Give me
that.
to buy more guns.
Now we won't get attacked so much in the comments section, with our lack of knowledge, right?
Yes.
We brought in an expert.
Yes. Thank you for legitimizing us.
Well, and my disclaimer always has to be, I'm not providing any legal advice to any viewers. This is conversational, and any questions specific to how the laws might apply to any individual should be vetted through an attorney that has an attorney-client relationship with that attorney that's providing the advice. So,
awesome.
Well said. Thank you, sir.
You bet. My pleasure.
Later.